Hi there. Welcome to Neuroscience Weekly. We'll be discussing the role of the amazing astrocyte. But in order to grasp the magnitude and the power of the astrocyte, we need to do just a little bit of background. So let me draw you a picture of what exactly makes the astrocyte so amazing. So we've heard of neurons, and we recognize that when our synapses aren't firing today, it means we're just not thinking as clearly as we would like. But what does that look like exactly? Let me show you. So we have the neuron, and it projects out through the axon. And this is what allows the connection between another neuron. Now, the different types of neurons, there are different types. They connect to a variety of other neurons. And it's actually amazing how they communicate because it's not just kind of like talk between people. There's electrochemical connections. Now, for those of you familiar with this topic, this will be a brief review. For those of you that don't know, it will provide a little bit of insight into what makes the astrocyte so amazing. The neurons that fire together wire together, which means you can learn and you can change. And this happens within minutes. Actually, they did an experiment and it proved that when blindfolded, subjects could learn Braille and they could actually see the brain live wire to change and to grow. In the absence of input, it was able to start the process of remodeling. But how? How is that possible? You may have heard the myth that you may lose neurons, but they don't ever grow back. Well, neuroplasticity actually doesn't quite convey the full power of this system because, as Brian Eagleman mentioned in his book, Live Wired, it's not hardwired and it's not plastic like once and done, but it's live wired, which means it happens in real time. Why is this relevant? Because we need to know how it works so that we can support our learning process by taking the right nutrients and to see the impact that that has on the learning process and why the amazing astrocyte really gives us pause for thought to what we do, how we learn, and how that impacts how we can retain what we learn. So the signal must be protected. And this is how that works. Oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes will actually help to form the myelin sheath. Now, why is it that these oligodendrocytes don't form something different? Say a long, continuous connection. Why is that? Because when we think of insulation for wires, we think of something like this. Maybe a really good quality, but it's long and it's continuous. But it's not like that in the brain. Why is that? Because signal loss happens. But to prevent that signal loss, when the electrical signal comes in, it must be rebroadcasted within the nodes of our NVA. And in that way, this can start the process of that signal getting through. So now the synaptic vesicles, which are just little packets of neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, things like that. Once that signal gets through, it is communicating. And this actually triggers that signal to go through, choom, choom. And that way it lights up. As you can imagine, this is energy intensive. And so what is needed is mitochondria. Mitochondria are actually the powerhouse for the cell. And there may be very many of them, but the byproduct of metabolism through this production of ATP, which are just little bundled up packets of energy. It's kind of like a nuclear power reactor. It has to be kept cool, and there could be byproducts. But what happens when the process goes awry? Free radicals. And that could start a process that needs to be kept in check by antioxidants, because oxidation, just like when you cut open an apple and it starts to brown, and when iron starts to rust, well, that's what oxygen does. But oxygen is such a powerful catalyst for energy that we need to breathe oxygen. So in the production process of energy, making that energy available for the cell, in order to keep oxidation in check, antioxidants need to be supplied. There is a master antioxidant called glutathione, and this tripeptide is not something that can fit into the cell. It's actually something that has to be made within the cell. But important for our discussion, the astrocyte is one of the types of glia, which is Latin for glue, cells in the brain that are responsible for remodeling, tapping into, repair the communications, the signals, all of that. The oligodendrocyte is one type of glial cell. As we'll get into just a little bit later, there's something called the microglia. It's a special immune cell for the brain. It's actually just a macrophage, but it's got the top security clearance to get through the blood-brain barrier and be assigned to be such. So the astrocyte is capable of tapping in to the connections, and it has something called enphy that it uses to communicate with each other via chemicals. That's why they weren't detected at first. Actually, when they first stained brain tissue, they didn't really understand that this stuff that looked like glue was actually playing a very critical role in neuronal functioning. But what they now know is that astrocytes don't just provide support, they actually can change the flow of information. Astro is Latin for star, as you imagined. It has different types of connections, and these will communicate with each other chemically, but when the neuron actually fires, it can pick that up. And as a result, it can decide whether these connections between these neurons needs to be strengthened, or if it's not firing often enough, it can decide to do away with it because it's not needed. And as the brain cells are fighting for real estate in order to keep things consistent and efficient, the astrocyte will actually influence what it is that the process will result in. For example, if you do something every day consistently, the astrocytes will pick up on that and they will make sure that the connections are strengthened. Neurons that fire together wire together because the astrocytes wire them together. So in this process, we've got the mitochondria. And as long as that's all functioning as it should, if it's functioning as it should, then there's no reason to do anything except monitor things. But let's just say something goes wrong more catastrophically. So that can happen because electrons, these free radicals, are basically just things that can steal other electrons, and that can actually start a process by which destruction happens. It can start to break down parts of the cell. And unfortunately, that can cause damage. And the process by which the, let's see, which one we use for that? I gotta pick one. So the cell nucleus has an endoplasmic reticulum around it, and it's sort of like the 3D printer. And it will work with the Golgi apparatus in order to distribute proteins as they're manufactured. The amino acids are strung together. For example, with the adequate blood supply to, in the vascular system, supply these necessary nutrients. And as that process allows for assembling those amino acids into something like glutathione or repair, and the glutathione can actually keep that mitochondria from breaking down. But if that individual mitochondrion is irreparably damaged and it causes further damage, well, there is a distress signal that is sent out. And what can happen is that, that's why I mentioned the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus, because the control center and the distribution process after the manufacturing of these proteins, something goes awry due to something like free radicals. Well, this is detected by the astrocytes. What if the damage is not repairable? Say, in the event of catastrophic damage, well, it turns out that the astrocytes can call and coordinate the microglia. And that's important because this very special type of immune cell can be pulled in to assist. Because the process of free radical destruction will perpetuate. It will not stop itself. And if it gets out of control, the job of the astrocyte is to do damage control. So they can actually mobilize and see to it that the necessary nutrients are supplied. They can actually influence the flow of nutrients. It can actually bathe the neuron and actually sync up with the vascular system and make sure that the nutrients are supplied But if the damage is too far gone for these very important connections to be maintained and for the integrity of the brain in order to prevent further damage, what the astrocyte will do is actually wall off the section of damage. And then it will coordinate with the microglia. That's important because the microglia, those little black spider looking things, will actually program this neuron that is now gone defunct. It's just too far gone. The damage is too extensive to do apoptosis, which basically is programmed cell death. And that will allow the orderly packaging of the neuron, and it will actually be packaged all the components so that it won't continue on with the damage. For example, if there's a virus that gets in there or some other kind of infection, what it could do is keep all those parts of the dead cell bagged up. That's what the purpose of apoptosis is, so that it doesn't just explode into smithereens, causing further damage. So the microglia will actually make sure that necessary repairs are made, and they all coordinate together to recruit, say, a stem cell. And a stem cell can actually be called into action and brought into where it used to be, and then be assigned as a new neuron. And as the growth process continues, you've got a new neuron that continues to grow in an orderly fashion, will pick up where the other ones left off. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to reconnect to other neurons, but if it needs to happen, then the astrocyte will make sure that that is, in fact, what will happen. And fascinatingly, the neuron in the growth process can get assistance from the astrocyte, and it can actually influence the remodeling, making sure that the vascular system is sufficiently providing adequate nutrients. So all this goes on in the cell or around the cells by means of the astrocyte. So when we take in adequate nutrition, or even better, optimal nutrition, and we get the sleep that we need, and we take care of our bodies with exercise, moving every day, even if you can't really exercise, at least get some stretching, right? Because that will actually strengthen your health. It will strengthen your body. It will strengthen your mind. We can thank the job that the astrocyte does in this amazingly designed system that will continue to form new connections and make these connections part of who we are and what we think about and how we endure. That concludes this lesson. So I hope you found this illuminating. And until next time, good health to you.